He stepped outside for less than a minute, leaving everything exactly where it was. No struggle, no sound, no warning, just an absence that didn't make sense. What happened in those 60 seconds left no evidence, no witnesses, and no clear explanation. The neighborhood stayed quiet, the timeline stayed intact, and yet a man vanished completely. This is the story of a moment so ordinary that no one noticed it, stealing someone forever. The moment did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, folded into the ordinary flow of a day that looked identical to countless others before it. Nothing about the air, the light, or the sounds suggested significance. The world was functioning normally, moving forward with calm indifference. This was not a dramatic beginning. It was a moment designed to be forgotten, and that was precisely what made it dangerous. The day had settled into its familiar rhythm early on. Time moved at a steady pace, unbothered by urgency or disruption. Small decisions were made automatically, guided by habit rather than thought. Everything about the morning reinforced the idea that nothing unusual was coming. It was the kind of day that gave people confidence in routine, the kind that made the future feel predictable and secure. He moved through the hours without resistance. There was no tension in his posture, no distraction in his actions. His mind remained anchored in the present, focused on immediate tasks rather than distant worries. Responsibility shaped his movements, but it did not burden them. He was not rushing toward anything, nor was he avoiding something behind him. The day felt complete even before it was finished. The setting offered no warnings. The space around him was familiar, shaped by repetition and comfort. Every surface, every sound, every detail belonged where it was. Nothing felt altered or suspicious. The environment did not shift to signal danger, and there was no sudden silence to suggest interruption. The ordinary held its shape perfectly. When he stepped outside, it was without intention beyond the immediate moment. There was no preparation, no pause to reconsider. The action carried no weight because it never had before. It was a brief separation from indoors, measured in seconds, not minutes. The assumption of return existed so strongly it did not need to be spoken or acknowledged. Time continued as expected. Seconds passed evenly without distortion or hesitation. Nothing slowed, nothing accelerated. The world did not recognize the importance of what was happening because there was nothing to recognize yet. Life inside nearby spaces continued uninterrupted, anchored by the belief that this absence was temporary and insignificant. At first, the absence barely existed. It blended into expectation, protected by routine. A minute passed without notice, then another. These were not alarming intervals. They were ordinary gaps filled with assumption rather than concern. The belief that he would return remained intact, reinforced by every past moment that ended the same way. This is how the most unsettling events often begin, not with fear, but with comfort, not with noise, but with silence that feels natural. The ordinary does not draw attention to itself. It allows moments to slip by unexamined, trusting that familiarity equals safety. That trust is what makes it powerful. The absence did not demand explanation because nothing had changed yet. No object had fallen out of place, no sound had interrupted the calm. The world behaved as it always had, and that behavior reassured those nearby that nothing was wrong. The idea that something irreversible had begun did not exist yet. Later, this moment would be dissected repeatedly. Every second would be examined, every detail measured for meaning. People would search for signs they believed they must have missed. They would wonder how something so small could hide something so final. But in real time, the moment passed without resistance, unmarked and unnoticed. What made it unbearable in hindsight was not action, but inaction. There was no visible turning point, no clear line where normal ended and something else began. The story did not announce its opening. It slipped quietly into existence, protected by expectation. The environment did not react because it had no reason to. Nothing signaled danger, nothing disrupted the rhythm of the day. The moment fit perfectly inside ordinary life, indistinguishable from thousands of others that came before it. That sameness became its camouflage. By the time the absence began to feel wrong, the moment itself had already closed. Whatever occurred within it remained sealed and inaccessible. The ordinary had completed its role, hiding something extraordinary without effort or intention. This was not a dramatic disappearance, it was a quiet fracture. A harmless decision expanded into an unanswered absence, stretching far beyond what anyone expected. The minute that should have meant nothing became the foundation of everything that followed. Only later would people understand that the simplicity of this moment was not evidence of safety, but its greatest disguise. By the time awareness arrived, the moment was gone, and it had taken him with it.
Understanding why his disappearance felt so wrong required understanding the man as he existed before the absence rewrote him. He was not mysterious, reckless, or distant. He lived in a way that encouraged familiarity rather than curiosity. His presence did not demand attention, yet it was quietly reliable, the kind that settled into other people's lives without friction. He was known not because he stood out, but because he never failed to be where he was supposed to be. His life followed a steady internal logic shaped by responsibility. Decisions were rarely impulsive. Choices were filtered through practicality, obligation, and long-term thinking. He did not chase excitement or novelty. Stability was not something he lacked. It was something he had deliberately built over time. That stability became a silent contract with the people around him, an unspoken agreement that he would continue to exist exactly as expected. Those closest to him trusted that predictability completely. His routines were not rigid, but they were respected. Mornings followed the same sequence. Workdays ended the same way. Weekends were structured loosely but consistently, anchored by small habits that gave shape to time. These patterns were not signs of boredom, they were expressions of balance. He appeared content within them, never restless, never searching for escape. Emotionally, he was even-tempered. Stress did not manifest as withdrawal or volatility. When problems arose, he addressed them methodically rather than emotionally. There were no dramatic swings in mood, no signs of internal collapse. He processed life quietly, carrying weight without advertising it. This emotional steadiness made it difficult to imagine him unraveling without warning. His relationships reflected the same consistency. Connections were long-term rather than intense. He did not surround himself with chaos or conflict. Trust accumulated slowly and remained intact once established. He listened more than he spoke, and rarely positioned himself at the center of attention. People relied on him because he made himself reliable without making promises he could not keep. Financially, his life showed no signs of desperation or secrecy. Accounts were orderly, spending was predictable, and obligations were met on time. There were no unexplained withdrawals, no preparations for sudden departure, no hints of financial pressure that might push someone toward disappearance. Everything about his material life pointed toward continuation, not abandonment. Professionally, he was stable as well. He was not trapped, nor was he trying to escape. Work was not a burden he resented, but a responsibility he accepted. He planned ahead, followed through, and maintained a reputation built on consistency rather than ambition. There was no career crisis, no looming consequence that required flight. His future at work existed as clearly as his past.
In the days leading up to the disappearance, nothing about his behavior suggested closure or farewell. There were no emotional goodbyes, no unfinished business intentionally left unresolved. Plans extended forward naturally, implying expectation rather than finality. He behaved like someone who assumed he would be present tomorrow, next week, and beyond. When people began searching his past for explanations, they found none that satisfied logic. There was no pattern of isolation, no hidden life, no indication of internal fracture. The deeper they looked, the more intact he appeared. This absence of warning became its own form of evidence, pointing away from voluntary disappearance and toward something external and unresolved. What unsettled everyone was the gap between who he was and what had happened. The man they knew did not align with the outcome they were facing. He had not been drifting away from his life, he had been embedded in it. His absence did not emerge from instability, it interrupted stability. As days passed, the certainty about his character became a source of unease rather than comfort. The more clearly people understood him, the less sense the disappearance made. It forced a painful realization. Knowing someone well does not protect them from vanishing without explanation. Eventually, attention shifted away from his personality and toward the silence surrounding it. If the explanation did not exist within him, then it had to exist elsewhere. That conclusion carried an unsettling implication, one that no one was ready to fully confront yet. Because if a man this grounded could disappear without leaving a trace, then the rules people trusted about safety, predictability, and normal life were far less reliable than they believed.
The timeline should have been the most reliable part of the story. Time does not bend easily, and minutes are supposed to behave predictably. They move forward, mark events, and leave evidence behind. In this case, however, the exact minute when everything went wrong refused to function the way a minute should. It existed, it passed, but it did not explain itself. Reconstructing that minute became an obsession later because it was the last point where certainty still seemed possible. Before it, everything made sense. After it, nothing did. Investigators and observers returned to that narrow window repeatedly, convinced that if they could understand those 60 seconds, the rest of the story would unlock itself. But the more precisely they examined it, the more unstable it became. The moment began cleanly. There was no rush, no confusion, no competing activity. He was not multitasking or distracted. His movement was simple, direct, and unremarkable. The decision to step outside did not interrupt anything important. It fit naturally into the flow of the day, almost as if the minute had been designed to disappear unnoticed. Spatially, nothing should have gone wrong. The area was contained, familiar, and visible. Entry points were limited. Sight lines were clear. There were no obvious places to vanish into, no natural barriers that would block awareness. Logic suggested that movement through this space should have been observable, traceable, and explainable. Instead, the opposite occurred. As seconds passed, the environment remained unchanged. Sounds continued at their normal volume. No disturbance cut through the atmosphere. The absence of noise was not suspicious at the time, it was expected. The world did not react because nothing had announced itself as wrong. The minute maintained the appearance of normal progression. When later attempts were made to trace movement during that time, they ran into immediate friction. The expected markers were incomplete. A sequence that should have been continuous showed subtle breaks, moments where presence simply ceased to register. These gaps were small enough to dismiss individually, but together they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. Technology offered little clarity. Devices that should have confirmed location and duration instead produced partial confirmations. Data existed, but it was fragmented, as if the minute had slipped between systems rather than through them. Timestamps aligned imperfectly, overlapping just enough to be confusing without being outright contradictory. Human observation proved equally unreliable. No one recalled seeing anything unusual, but that absence of memory was not comforting. It suggested either that nothing happened, or that whatever did happen blended so completely into the environment that it registered as meaningless. Both possibilities were deeply unsettling. The most disturbing aspect was how short the window truly was. This was not an extended gap where complexity could hide. It was a single minute, narrow and contained. There was no room for elaborate explanations, no space for prolonged activity. Whatever occurred had to fit cleanly into that time frame, and yet no explanation fit at all. Attempts to stretch the timeline failed. There was no evidence the minute was longer than it appeared. Attempts to compress it failed as well. Time did not seem distorted, only emptied. The minute existed, passed, and left behind a blank space where cause and effect should have been. As focus narrowed further, the minute began to feel isolated from the rest of the day. Everything before it led naturally toward it. Everything after it reacted to its consequences. Yet the minute itself resisted connection. It behaved like a sealed container, detached from narrative flow. This detachment raised an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the mistake was assuming the minute behaved normally at all. Perhaps the problem was not what happened during it, but how it intersected with everything else. The idea that time could function differently within ordinary life was not one anyone wanted to entertain, yet nothing else explained the gap. Repeated analysis produced diminishing returns. Each pass through the minute stripped away assumptions rather than adding clarity. Certainty dissolved instead of strengthening. The more closely the timeline was examined, the less reliable it appeared, until even basic conclusions felt unstable. What remained was a single fact that refused to change. At the start of the minute, he was present. At the end of it, he was not. No intermediate state could be confirmed. No transition could be observed. Presence did not fade, it ended. This abruptness defied human expectation. People usually do not vanish between moments without leaving some trace of movement, sound, or decision. The minute violated that expectation completely. It offered no gradual shift, no warning sign, no explanation. Eventually, the focus shifted away from trying to understand what happened inside the minute towards understanding why it left nothing behind. That absence became the most important clue, not because it answered questions, but because it exposed a limitation in how reality was being interpreted. The exact minute everything went wrong did not reveal itself through action. It revealed itself through silence. It marked the boundary between a life that followed rules and a mystery that refused to obey them. And once that minute passed, it did not stay in the past. It expanded outward, infecting every attempt to make sense of what followed, reminding everyone that whatever had occurred had done so without permission, without witnesses, and without explanation.
At first, the absence itself was treated as the problem. People assumed that once evidence emerged, clarity would follow. That belief did not survive contact with what was actually found. The earliest traces did not point toward explanation, they pointed toward contradiction. Instead of narrowing possibilities, each piece of evidence widened them, transforming a disappearance into something far more unsettling than a simple missing person case. The first discoveries were ordinary enough to be dismissed. Items remained exactly where they were expected to be. Personal belongings showed no signs of struggle, haste, or abandonment. Everything suggested interruption rather than intent. This was not the scene of someone preparing to leave. It was the scene of someone who expected to return within moments. That expectation, frozen in place, immediately complicated every theory that followed. Nothing appeared damaged or disturbed. The environment showed no marks of force or urgency. Surfaces remained untouched, arrangements intact. The absence had not left fingerprints of chaos behind it. Instead, it had preserved the scene in a way that felt unnatural, as if time had paused rather than progressed. The normal signs investigators rely on simply did not exist. What unsettled observers most was the balance of presence and absence. Some things remained with almost deliberate precision, while others were missing without explanation. Objects essential for leaving permanently were still there. Objects that would not normally move had shifted slightly. These inconsistencies were subtle, but they resisted dismissal. They hinted at movement without direction, change without intention. As attention turned toward digital traces, expectations were again undermined. Devices recorded activity up to a certain point, then stopped without transition. There were no frantic searches, no messages that suggested confusion or urgency. The silence that followed was not abrupt enough to feel violent, yet not gradual enough to feel natural. It sat uncomfortably between those extremes, offering no emotional narrative to follow. Attempts to interpret this silence produced conflicting conclusions. Some saw it as evidence of planning. Others saw it as proof of interruption. Neither explanation survived deeper examination. Planning would have left preparation. Interruption would have left reaction. What existed instead was neutrality, as if the disappearance itself had no emotional temperature at all. Physical evidence did not cooperate either. Measurements and locations aligned too neatly in some areas and too poorly in others. The logic of placement refused to settle into a coherent pattern. Every attempt to impose meaning exposed another inconsistency. The more closely evidence was examined, the less it seemed to belong to any recognizable scenario. One particular detail drew attention because it felt misplaced rather than missing. It was not something that should have mattered, yet it did. Its presence suggested a decision that conflicted with everything else known about the moment. It did not confirm wrongdoing or intention, but it disrupted the idea that nothing had happened at all. That disruption was enough to unsettle the entire case. What made this evidence especially troubling was its resistance to escalation. Normally, discoveries lead to momentum. Here, momentum collapsed. Each new detail closed off as many explanations as it opened. Progress became circular, revisiting the same unanswered questions from different angles without resolution. Observers began to realize that the evidence was not guiding them forward, it was anchoring them in place. The case stopped behaving like an investigation and began behaving like a paradox. Every conclusion felt provisional, vulnerable to collapse under the weight of the next discovery. The absence of certain expected traces became more important than the traces that existed. There were no transitional signs, no intermediate stages. Evidence did not show progression from presence to absence. It showed only that presence ended and absence began. The middle remained inaccessible. This gap forced a shift in thinking. The problem was no longer identifying what happened, it was understanding how something could happen without leaving the marks it should have left. The evidence was not incomplete, it was selectively silent. As this realization took hold, the case began to feel heavier. Not because answers were far away, but because the tools designed to reach them were failing. The evidence was not lying, it was refusing to speak. What unsettled people most was the growing sense that the evidence was not accidental. Not in the sense of intent or manipulation, but in the sense of alignment. Everything pointed toward a moment that ended without resolution, as if the disappearance itself had been contained, sealed, and removed cleanly from the world. By this stage, the absence no longer felt passive, it felt active in its restraint. The evidence did not dramatize what happened, it minimized it. That minimization made it harder to accept and harder to explain. As the case continued, one conclusion became unavoidable. The evidence was not going to provide clarity. It was going to demand a different question altogether. Not what happened, but how something could happen so completely without leaving behind the story of its own occurrence. That realization marked a turning point. From that moment on, the case was no longer about finding missing pieces. It was about confronting the possibility that nothing was missing at all, except understanding. And just as that thought settled in, a single overlooked detail resurfaced, quietly challenging every assumption built so far, suggesting that the evidence had not finished revealing its contradictions.
At first, the absence itself was treated as the problem. People assumed that once evidence emerged, clarity would follow. That belief did not survive contact with what was actually found. The earliest traces did not point toward explanation. They pointed toward contradiction. Instead of narrowing possibilities, each piece of evidence widened them, transforming a disappearance into something far more unsettling than a simple missing persons case. The first discoveries were ordinary enough to be dismissed. Items remained exactly where they were expected to be. Personal belongings showed no signs of struggle, haste, or abandonment. Everything suggested interruption rather than intent. This was not the scene of someone preparing to leave. It was the scene of someone who expected to return within moments. That expectation, frozen in place, immediately complicated every theory that followed. Nothing appeared damaged or disturbed. The environment showed no marks of force or urgency. Surfaces remained untouched, arrangements intact. The absence had not left fingerprints of chaos behind it. Instead, it had preserved the scene in a way that felt unnatural, as if time had paused rather than progressed. The normal signs investigators rely on simply did not exist. What unsettled observers most was the balance of presence and absence. Some things remained with almost deliberate precision, while others were missing without explanation. Objects essential for leaving permanently were still there. Objects that would not normally move had shifted slightly. These inconsistencies were subtle, but they resisted dismissal. They hinted at movement without direction, change without intention. As attention turned toward digital traces, expectations were again undermined. Devices recorded activity up to a certain point, then stopped without transition. There were no frantic searches, no messages that suggested confusion or urgency.
The silence that followed was not abrupt enough to feel violent, yet not gradual enough to feel natural. It sat uncomfortably between those extremes, offering no emotional narrative to follow. Attempts to interpret this silence produced conflicting conclusions. Some saw it as evidence of planning, others saw it as proof of interruption. Neither explanation survived deeper examination. Planning would have left preparation. Interruption would have left reaction. What existed instead was neutrality, as if the disappearance had no emotional temperature at all. Physical evidence did not cooperate either. Measurements and locations aligned too neatly in some areas and too poorly in others. The logic of placement refused to settle into a coherent pattern. Every attempt to impose meaning exposed another inconsistency. The more closely evidence was examined, the less it seemed to belong to any recognizable scenario. One particular detail drew attention because it felt misplaced rather than missing. It was not something that should have mattered, yet it did. Its presence suggested a decision that conflicted with everything else known about the moment. It did not confirm wrongdoing or intention, but it disrupted the idea that nothing had happened at all. That disruption was enough to unsettle the entire case. What made this evidence especially troubling was its resistance to escalation. Normally, discoveries lead to momentum. Here, momentum collapsed. Each new detail closed off as many explanations as it opened. Progress became circular, revisiting the same unanswered questions from different angles without resolution. Observers began to realize that the evidence was not guiding them forward, it was anchoring them in place. The case stopped behaving like an investigation and began behaving like a paradox. Every conclusion felt provisional, vulnerable to collapse under the weight of the next discovery. The absence of certain expected traces became more important than the traces that existed. There were no transitional signs, no intermediate stages. Evidence did not show progression from presence to absence. It showed only that presence ended and absence began. The middle remained inaccessible. This gap forced a shift in thinking. The problem was no longer identifying what happened. It was understanding how something could happen without leaving the marks it should have left. The evidence was not incomplete, it was selectively silent. As this realization took hold, the case began to feel heavier, not because answers were far away, but because the tools designed to reach them were failing. The evidence was not lying, it was refusing to speak. What unsettled people most was the growing sense that the evidence was not accidental, not in the sense of intent or manipulation, but in the sense of alignment. Everything pointed toward a moment that ended without resolution, as if the disappearance itself had been contained, sealed, and removed cleanly from the world. By this stage, the absence no longer felt passive, it felt active in its restraint. The evidence did not dramatize what happened, it minimized it. That minimization made it harder to accept and harder to explain. As the case continued, one conclusion became unavoidable. The evidence was not going to provide clarity. It was going to demand a different question altogether. Not what happened, but how something could happen so completely without leaving behind the story of its own occurrence. That realization marked a turning point. From that moment on, the case was no longer about finding missing pieces. It was about confronting the possibility that nothing was missing at all, except understanding. And just as that thought settled in, a single overlooked detail resurfaced, quietly challenging every assumption built so far, suggesting that the evidence had not finished revealing its contradictions.
What made this harder to accept
was how unchanged the neighborhood felt afterward. Even as concern grew, the streets looked the same, the houses stood undisturbed, the calm remained intact. This disconnect between appearance and reality created unease. If something could disappear here, in a place defined by predictability, then safety itself felt unreliable. Gradually, focus shifted away from what the neighborhood concealed and toward what it enabled. The question was no longer where someone could have gone, but how the environment allowed a person to vanish without triggering alarm. The answer did not lie in hidden spaces, but in shared assumptions. Normalcy had acted as cover. The neighborhood was not complicit, but it was permissive. Its order did not protect against absence, it disguised it. The routines that made life feel safe also made it easier for something irreversible to pass unnoticed. That realization reframed the entire case. By the time this understanding settled in, another unsettling thought followed close behind. If the neighborhood had failed to notice what mattered most, then perhaps someone within it had noticed something after all and chosen not to question it. Silence, after all, does not always mean ignorance. And with that possibility, the neighborhood stopped being neutral. It became uncertain terrain, not because of what it revealed, but because of what it allowed to disappear without resistance. The investigation began with confidence, built on the assumption that clarity would emerge once enough attention was applied. Processes were followed, steps were taken, and information was gathered with methodical precision. At first, progress felt inevitable. Disappearances, after all, usually bend under sustained scrutiny. This one did not. Instead, the deeper the investigation went, the more it curved back on itself, returning to the same unanswered questions in different forms. Early efforts focused on establishing certainty. Timelines were reviewed, movements retraced, and known facts organized into clean sequences. On paper, the case appeared manageable. There were defined boundaries, a clear last-seen moment, and a contained environment. These factors normally produce direction. Here, they produced repetition. Each pass through the material reinforced what was already known without revealing anything new. As days passed, momentum slowed. Leads that initially seemed promising dissolved under closer examination. Details that felt meaningful at first proved irrelevant later. The investigation began consuming its own time, revisiting familiar ground rather than breaking new paths. This circularity was not caused by negligence or lack of effort. It emerged from the absence of friction where friction should have existed. The lack of escalation was particularly unsettling. Most investigations intensify as inconsistencies surface. In this case, inconsistencies existed from the beginning, but they did not point anywhere. They contradicted one another just enough to prevent resolution, while never forming a coherent alternative explanation. The case resisted simplification without offering complexity in return. Professionals involved found themselves recalibrating expectations. Standard frameworks failed to apply cleanly. Profiles did not align. Predictive reasoning collapsed. Each attempt to impose structure exposed another gap, another place where logic should have connected, but did not. The investigation was not stalled by missing information alone, by information that refused to behave. Repeated reviews of the same evidence produced diminishing returns. Familiar details were examined from new angles, yet the outcome remained unchanged. The disappearance could not be explained by accumulation. More data did not equal more clarity. Instead, it reinforced the sense that the case was self-contained, sealed against progression. This stagnation introduced a quiet form of frustration, not anger or urgency, but a slow erosion of confidence in process. When established methods fail without clear reason, doubt spreads inward. Questions arose not just about the case, but about the assumptions underlying investigation itself. If a disappearance could remain intact against sustained scrutiny, what did that imply about the limits of understanding? Time became an adversary rather than an ally. As days turned into weeks, the absence hardened into permanence. Each passing hour reduced the likelihood of organic discovery. Yet despite this pressure, nothing accelerated. The investigation did not break forward or collapse entirely. It hovered in place, suspended between effort and futility. Outside observers began to sense the circularity as well. Updates repeated familiar language. Developments felt incremental without being meaningful. The case appeared active, yet unchanged. This perception added another layer of tension, as a tension without progress heightened unease rather than resolving it. Internally, the focus shifted from discovery to interpretation. With no new facts emerging, meaning was sought within existing ones. But interpretation without anchor points led nowhere productive. Every theory could be partially supported and partially dismantled using the same set of facts. The investigation became an exercise in controlled uncertainty.
This environment allowed unofficial explanations to surface quietly, not because they were supported, but because official channels offered no resolution. These explanations lingered at the edges, unspoken yet persistent. Their presence reflected not belief, but discomfort with stagnation. When movement stops, speculation fills the void. What made this phase particularly difficult was the absence of error. There was no single misstep to correct, no overlooked detail that promised breakthrough. The investigation was thorough, disciplined, and relentless. Its failure to advance was not a reflection of weakness, but of resistance. The case did not yield because it did not need to. Eventually, the realization settled in that forward motion might not come from within the existing framework. The investigation had exhausted its linear options. Progress, if it was to happen, would require a shift rather than an extension. That idea was unsettling because it suggested that the case was not incomplete, but misaligned. This shift in thinking marked a subtle turning point, not because it produced answers, but because it acknowledged limitation. The investigation was no longer chasing resolution. It was confronting the possibility that resolution might not behave as expected. And within that recognition, another troubling idea began to form. If the investigation could not move forward despite exhaustive effort, then perhaps the case was not meant to be solved through conventional means at all. That possibility lingered, unresolved and uncomfortable, as the investigation continued to turn in place, circling the same questions while something unseen waited beyond the reach of method and process. As the investigation stalled, a different kind of tension began to surface. One that had nothing to do with missing evidence and everything to do with human resistance. When facts refuse to align and logic fails to resolve contradiction, attention inevitably turns toward explanations that feel uncomfortable rather than unlikely. This was the stage where the case entered dangerous territory, not because of what could be proven, but because of what could no longer be ignored. Up to this point, every effort had focused on maintaining familiar frameworks. Investigators clung to rational sequences, measurable movement, and expected outcomes. These structures offered psychological safety even as they failed. Letting go of them meant acknowledging that something had occurred outside normal patterns, and that acknowledgement carried consequences no one was prepared to face. The explanation that began to surface did not arrive fully formed. It emerged gradually through elimination rather than discovery. One by one, acceptable possibilities collapsed under scrutiny. Voluntary disappearance did not fit the psychological profile. Accidental departure did not fit the environment. External interference lacked supporting disturbance. Each dismissal narrowed the field until what remained felt less like a theory and more like a shadow. What made this explanation so difficult was its subtlety. It did not rely on dramatic action or hidden antagonists. It suggested that something could intervene without announcing itself, without resistance, and without leaving conventional traces. This idea threatened deeply held beliefs about causality and control. It implied vulnerability where people preferred certainty. Emotionally, there was pushback. The explanation felt unfair, almost disrespectful to the effort already invested. Accepting it would mean admitting that diligence, logic, and method had limits. It would mean conceding that not every event could be reconstructed or understood through effort alone. That concession was not easily made. Professionals involved avoided naming the explanation outright. It lingered in phrasing, implication, and careful language. Discussions circled it without landing, acknowledging its presence without endorsing it. This avoidance was not accidental. Naming it would have forced a confrontation with uncertainty that no one felt equipped to manage. What gave the explanation weight was not evidence in the traditional sense, but alignment. It fit the absence of disruption. It accounted for the missing middle. It explained why evidence existed without narrative and why timelines remained intact yet incomplete. It did not answer questions, but it stopped contradicting them. This alignment made it unsettling. Explanations are supposed to clarify, not destabilize. This one did the opposite. It suggested that the disappearance was not the result of chaos, but of precision, not violence, but erasure, not confusion, but removal without residue. Those closest to the case reacted with quiet resistance. Accepting this explanation felt like surrender. It offered no resolution, no closure, and no justice. It replaced hope with acceptance, a trade few were willing to make. And yet, refusing it meant remaining trapped in circular reasoning with no exit. The explanation also carried broader implications. If it were possible here, in this controlled environment, then it was possible elsewhere. It suggested that safety was conditional, dependent on factors that could not be measured or monitored. That implication extended far beyond this case, touching on assumptions people relied on daily. Gradually, the explanation stopped feeling optional. It was not embraced, but it was acknowledged. It existed in the background of every discussion, shaping interpretation without being officially adopted. Its power came from persistence rather than proof. What ultimately made it unavoidable was its silence. Unlike other theories, it did not demand belief. It simply remained when everything else had been discarded. Its endurance became its credibility.
When all acceptable explanations fail, the unacceptable one gains weight by default. This did not bring peace, it brought a different kind of unease. The case no longer felt unresolved because of missing information, but because of an explanation that could not be acted upon. Understanding did not lead to resolution, it led to awareness. As this awareness settled in, attention shifted again. If the explanation was real, even partially, then the case was not over, it had merely changed shape. The absence was no longer just a question of where someone went, but of how reality itself had permitted the departure. And just as this realization took hold, a small development surfaced, subtle but undeniable, offering the first indication that this explanation might not remain theoretical for long.
When time passed, it did not move on in the way people expected. Days accumulated, calendars changed, and routines resumed. But the minute he stepped outside refused to stay behind. It lingered, expanding quietly into everything that followed. The absence did not fade with distance, it deepened. What had begun as a brief interruption settled into permanence, altering how the case was remembered and how reality itself was interpreted. At first, people assumed time would resolve what understanding could not. That assumption proved false. Instead of providing closure, time sharpened the edges of uncertainty. The longer the absence remained unexplained, the more defined it became. The minute stopped being a point on a timeline and became a presence of its own, shaping every attempt to make sense of the story. Life continued, but not cleanly. Those connected to the case adjusted outwardly, while remaining internally anchored to that unresolved moment. Conversations shifted around it, decisions were measured against it. The future carried an unspoken condition, shaped by the knowledge that something ordinary had once failed catastrophically. The disappearance was no longer an event, it was a reference point. Attempts to reframe the case eventually slowed. Theories lost momentum, not because they were disproven, but because they exhausted themselves. Attention drifted away from resolution and toward coexistence with uncertainty. The question was no longer how to solve the disappearance, but how to live alongside it without answers. This shift changed the emotional texture of the case. Early urgency gave way to a quieter, heavier awareness. The absence stopped demanding immediate explanation and began demanding acknowledgement. It existed as a reminder that not everything broken announces itself loudly. Some fractures are silent, widening over time without warning. The minute itself became symbolic. It represented the boundary between assumption and reality, between what people believed about safety and what the case had revealed. That single, ordinary action challenged the idea that predictability guaranteed protection. It exposed the fragility of routines people relied on without question. Even those with only distant connection felt its influence. The story lingered because it did not fit established categories. It resisted resolution, not through complexity, but through simplicity. A man stepped outside and did not return. That was all that could be confirmed. Everything else remained interpretation. The absence also changed how moments were perceived afterward. People paid closer attention to transitions, to brief departures, to the spaces between actions. Ordinary minutes no longer felt disposable. The idea that significance could hide inside something so small unsettled those who encountered the story. It suggested that meaning did not always announce itself when it arrived. Over time, the case stopped producing developments, but it continued producing questions, not investigative ones, but existential ones. What does it mean when something disappears without explanation? How much of reality depends on assumption rather than certainty?
These questions extended beyond the case, touching beliefs people carried quietly. The lack of closure did not dull interest, it refined it. The story endured because it refused to conclude. It existed in a state of suspension, neither solved nor forgotten. The minute that began it all remained open, unresolved, stretching forward rather than closing behind. Eventually, acceptance took a specific form, not acceptance of explanation, but acceptance of limitation, the understanding that some events do not resolve cleanly, and that seeking closure where none exists can distort truth rather than clarify it. This acceptance was not comforting, but it was stabilizing. The case remained intact because it did not collapse under scrutiny. It resisted conclusion without disintegrating. That endurance became its final shape. The disappearance was no longer a puzzle waiting to be solved. It was a reminder of uncertainty embedded within ordinary life. In this way, the minute never truly ended. It continued influencing perception, shaping caution, and unsettling confidence. It existed not as memory, but as condition, a permanent pause in the narrative of normalcy. And perhaps that was its final impact, not to provide answers, but to challenge the assumption that answers are always possible, to remind those who encountered the story that the ordinary is not always harmless, and that some moments, once opened, never fully close again.
The minute he stepped outside never gave him back, and time never corrected itself. No final answer arrived. No missing piece clicked into place, and the silence remained intact. What unsettled people most was not what might have happened, but how easily it happened at all. A familiar place, a predictable life, and a single ordinary moment proved to be enough. The case did not end with resolution, but with a warning hidden inside routine. Because if something so complete can disappear without resistance, certainty itself becomes fragile. The story lingers not for what it explains, but for what it refuses to answer. And long after the questions fade, that one quiet minute continues to wait, unresolved. Some stories end when the video stops. This one doesn't. If this minute unsettled you, there are more moments like it waiting to be examined. Every disappearance leaves behind questions most people never think to ask. Stay close to the stories that challenge what normal really means. The next one begins exactly where certainty breaks.